Thank you, Paul. And it's wonderful to be back here. I've spent many hours at those tables that you see back there, and it's very nice to be standing up here and speaking to you. 2 years ago, when my wife and I were in Lerwick, Shetland, the zipper on my pants went. And the owner of the B&B, I only had one pair, took me over to the window, pointed out there, and told me to go to that store, and that I'd find a pair. And I did, and I went up to pay for them, and the clerk said, "This is your lucky day, there's a senior discount." And great, I replied, "A penny saved is a penny earned." She looked at me. "That's what my grandmother used to say." I told her it was from Benjamin Franklin. She denied that. It was my grandmother. And so I learned something. And I realized that by the time I walked back to the 25 yards to the B&B, that I had learned that Benjamin Franklin's maxims had become part of Western culture, and not just in this country. And the kind of things that grandmothers and grandfathers pass on to their grandchildren without themselves knowing the source. So one of the questions I'm going to try to answer tonight is, how did that happen? And I'm going to use my biographical work on the way to wealth to try to do that. The business school is, Harvard Business School is now producing a somewhat truncated version of the bibliography, and this is the home page of that. The bibliography covers up to the year 1850, and I've attempted to describe all appearances in all languages. Appearances is the crucial word here, not editions, not printings, appearances in books and other formats of whatever sort. Franklin's untitled preface to a Pennsylvania almanac was not literally a bestseller. After all, the term does not apply to appearances. But the bibliography indicates that by 1850, Franklin's text had become one of the most well-known, perhaps the most well-known of all secular texts, with about 1,130 appearances. The number is incredible. But so is the fact of its spread from a periphery, far distant from the centers of European culture. Philadelphia in 1757 was on the periphery. And it spread from the periphery of Philadelphia into other peripheries, linguistic ones, such as Gaelic and Breton, and also geographical ones, such as Sibiu, Tasmania, Reykjavik, or Rio. The word journey in the title of this lecture, it must be said, is, however, a bit problematic. Most of us, after all, would plan a journey. But even more problematic would be use of the word dissemination, because Franklin did not disseminate the text. Well, perhaps a little bit. And neither did America disseminate the text. Nations and cultures do not export text, or at least did not do so. With John Hinch sitting here, I have to qualify that to say that it's in the past that was the case. And even importations in the form of English language reprints are susceptible to alteration. And in the period from 1757 to 1850, translations frequently were altered. Translating is not a neutral act. And translations being made for a reason were altered to serve that purpose. Before looking in some detail at the statistics about the number and places and languages in which this text appeared, it seems desirable to describe it. It's short, only about 3,500 words, which made it a good length for republishing, to be sure sometimes even as filler. And printers did like to print a work by one of their own. The earliest form of the text has a 2-paragraph introduction by Poor Richard. And those paragraphs, which can be interpreted in different ways, have been written about by Jim Green and Peter Stallygrass in an essay in their 2006 book on Franklin, which I commend to you, and I'm not going to go into those versions. The other main version truncates those two paragraphs to one sentence. I have heard that nothing gives an author so great pleasure as to find his works respectfully quoted by others. Then it moves right into setting the scene, which is a group of people awaiting the start of an auction. They're complaining about the bad economic times, and someone calls out to a clean old man with white locks. Father Abraham, what do you think? Will the high taxes ruin the country? Father Abraham then answers at length, repeatedly quoting maxims of Poor Richard. Then at the end, Poor Richard reappears. He notes that his vanity was wonderfully delighted with hearing himself quoted so often, and he is resolved to be the better for Father Abraham's discourse. Now the others who had been awaiting the auction, they had treated it, he says, as a common sermon. That is, not at all. For they had begun to buy superfluities. Poor Richard, though, turns away from the auction, stating his resolve to wear his old coat a little longer. And he addresses a final sentence directly to the reader. If thou wilt do the same, thy profit will be as great as mine. Now within that story framework, Father Abraham's discourse has three main sections. The first basically admonishes the listeners to work hard. We're taxed twice as much by our idleness as by the government. The next section is about using proper care. That is, do the work yourself and not rely too much on others. And take care of your tools. That's the briefer section. Then the third advocates frugality and strongly warns against going into debt. Points are driven home by quoting maxims of Poor Richard. So that woman in Shetland grew up knowing the one about the value of money. But there are many more that you know, perhaps even have quoted to your children or grandchildren. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. Lost time is never found again. Creditors have better memories than debtors, and so on and so on. So Franklin is here replacing the morality of religion with a secular morality, and he makes that point unmistakable, indeed, by drawing attention in Father Abraham's discourse to be treated as a common sermon. Franklin's work told the reader how to behave in this life so as to gain tangible rewards here on earth. Now, as I said, by 1850, this text had appeared about 1,130 times in 26 languages. And here you can see the figures for appearances in the British Isles. And here you can see the figures for Italy, France, and Germany. And you can see that it also appeared on four continents, Europe, Australia, and the two Americas, where besides the US, it came out in Argentina, Barbados, Brazil, Canada, and Cuba. And within the major European cultural areas, it was not spread solely by colporteurs or printed only in major publishing centers. Here is a list of publications in England, and you can see that it was distributed all over. And this is this will be in the database, and you can. This is a visual depiction of the places as of 1820. Even in France, contrary to what one might expect, publication was not confined to Paris. And in the decentralized German lands, one would expect publishing in many places, and that is indeed what one finds. Now, besides the hundreds of appearances in English, French, German, and Italian, it came out in Danish, Dutch, Norwegian, Polish, Portuguese, Romanian, Russian, Spanish, and Swedish, also in Gaelic, Welsh, Bulgarian, Croatian, Czech, Slovene, Slovak, Romansh, Greek, Icelandic, Finnish, Hungarian, and Breton. No acts of dissemination, no exporting was responsible for this. These all represent importations. Now you may have noted that some of these languages are not well-established literary languages in clearly demarcated cultural areas. But in that period of rising nationalism, there were various efforts to form distinct cultural, linguistic, and in some cases, new national areas. And some of these translations in 25 languages are related to the increasing nationalism. And those translations constitute a piece of evidence that transcends the number of 1,130 printings, appearances. Those translations showed that Franklin's text had become a standard work. Pascal Casanova explains this in her The World Republic of Letters. To make the local oral language into a literary language that could be used to produce a national literature, it was necessary to increase the literary capital of the language. In other words, to build up the text in the language, and especially the text regarded as part of the broader cultural world. Put somewhat differently, a text would not have been imported into 25 languages without having become widely published in English, French, and German. And indeed, versions in French and German were often a source language for translations into German, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, Russian, and Spanish. And German was a source language for translations into Dutch, Hungarian, Russian, and I'm quite sure others. Now, I've used the expression standard work, which is of course a mushy term. And by it I do not mean an acquaintance with it such as one might have from hearing of a good novel, or the acquaintance that we have with a work that we know we really ought to read but haven't. People knew the way too well, somewhat more in the way that one knows a prayer book. Now, if you're Anglican or Episcopalian, you can perhaps recite the creed or the closing prayer, even if you stumble over it a bit. And the following images suggest something approaching that kind of familiarity with Franklin's text. Now, here is a lithographed edition published as part of a French work. And the general title of that French work is Little Course in Morality, as you can see at the top. And the statement on the title page, which is not here, reads, "For learning to read handwriting." This was for children to learn to read handwriting. And here is a German work for showing 84 different handwriting styles. And the text that they chose was also The Way to Wealth. And here is a book that Isaac Pitman brought out in 1850 to demonstrate the ease of writing and reading this new system of phonography. Now, for these publications to serve their purpose, it was essential that the text in them be a text so well known as to be nearly memorized. Some of you may have learned shorthand. So you know that when you learn with easy words and above all with texts that are easy to read. And of course, the easiest text of all to read is one that you basically know. Well, I did learn shorthand, and I even have a vague memory of reading Lincoln's Gettysburg Address in shorthand, a text that I'd earlier learned. So these three publications show that The Way to Wealth, originally an untitled introduction to a little-valued genre, almanacs, published on the periphery of European culture, had entered into the minds of Europeans. And of course, it had Americans as well. Now, some other kinds of publications also show that kind of widespread familiarity. Those are ones produced for promotional purposes. Now here is Franklin being used in this country to sell patent medicines. And here is a publication also in this country that was produced not only to stimulate interest in the society for the encouragement of the faithful domestic servants, but also to promote savings accounts. And here Franklin's text is used to promote temperance. Well, you'll have to look down beneath Richard Saunders, and you'll see that it does advocate abstinence. Another kind of evidence relevant to showing familiarity with the way to wealth is the use of Poor Richard in other circumstances. In a French appearance of 1791, it was reported that the text was so widely known in the United States that no one states a moral sentence, a political maxim, a philosophical axiom, a juridical aphorism, a popular proverb, or a common adage without adding, as Poor Richard says. I thought this was a wild exaggeration. But then I looked up in America's historical newspapers from 1790 to 1811, the product of this institution and Redex Company. And if you look up, as Poor Richard says, you will find it numerous times. And if you look up Bon Homme Richard on the web, that's the title that, Bon Homme Richard, Poor Richard became Bon Homme Richard in French. There are, besides hits for the ship of that name, which is of course renamed by John Paul Jones in honor of Franklin, numerous others showing that Bon Homme Richard was a figure in music and theater and in many other venues. So, Franklin's text appeared a large number of times, and it became part of the cultural capital of the Western world. And perhaps you were persuaded that the words entered deeply into the consciousness, even the language of Americans and Europeans. But what message did people take from it? You may have noticed that I've so far largely spoken of Franklin's text rather than The Way to Wealth. I've done so because the published title was by no means always The Way to Wealth, or its equivalent in other languages. Moreover, Franklin's name was not always associated with the text. As noted, at the end of 57, it appeared as the untitled preface in Poor Richard's Almanac. And in 1758, Franklin's nephew published it in Boston with a very long title, Father Abraham's Speech to a Great Number of People at a Rendezvous of Merchant Goods, introduced to the public by Poor Richard, a famous Pennsylvanian conjurer and almanac maker, in answer to the following questions. Pray, Father Abraham, what think you of the times? Etc., etc. So, one could imagine, what was it that people actually thought they were getting when they bought that book? But they did buy it, and maybe they thought it was about telling them how to pay their taxes. In 1758 in London, the Grand magazine published Franklin's text as a curious preliminary address to the Pennsylvania Almanac, entitled Poor Richard Improved, for the year 1758. And among the periodical reprints was a Newcastle periodical. The wife of its printer was Anne Fisher, who was editor of an anthology for school children. She put this text in her next edition, and she added to the title 4 words on economy and frugality. Now, Anne Fisher's pleasing instructor was so popular that it was pirated, and it went through at least 30 editions up to the first decade of the 19th century. And every edition was identical. Each had the subtitle on economy and frugality, and not a single one identified Franklin as the author. Richard Saunders, Poor Richard, was the author. So Franklin's growing fame had little impact for decades on the spread of his text. Even those that began to appear in 1773 under the title of The Way to Wealth did not bear Franklin's name. He was not noted as the author either in the U.S. or Britain until 1776 1779, the year that Benjamin Vaughan's collected edition appeared in London. And after 1779, Franklin's name was by no means always associated with the text, or was it given the title The Way to Wealth, even in English. The earliest dated appearance with the title of The Way to Wealth is actually in French, and the title there is Le Moyen de s'enrichir, in a collected edition of that year, edited by someone by the name of Dubourg. In France, it was not reprinted as The Way to Wealth, but in 1777, in a physiocratic publication, it came out as La Science, the Science of Bonhomme Richard, under Franklin's name. The title was standard thereafter in French, although from 1821, a subtitle was usually added, Le Chemin de Faire Fortune, another way of saying The Way to Wealth. Note that the word science in the title elevated the text, and in fact, nowhere else is Franklin so highly praised and his text so highly thought of as in France. It even appears in 1847 in the multi-volume collection of the Principled Economists, in a volume along with Hume, Condorcet, and Condillac. Poor Richard had certainly risen in the world. So, there is another way to see the text, that it was seen as a scientific treatise. In Germany, a curious pamphlet appeared in 1771 with Franklin's text. This work in English, Remarkable American Household Calendar, adapted to the present times. Elizabeth, if you ever see an almanac with that title, please do buy it for the Antiquarian Society. and that almanac is signed JPC, and it's in print in Boston. It's clearly false, and its source was a mystery to me. How did it come to be published in Germany in 1771? Well, it was cleared up by finding an appearance in the Hannoverisches Magazine. And a note there explained that the text in the magazine had been in an almanac that had been given to the editor of the periodical by a friend who had brought it from America. And the note gave the full name of the periodicals of the editor of the almanac as Johann Peter Keller. So this plagiarized text, which appeared several times, was also included in 1779 in an annual that long continued to appear. Its title was Selection of the Best Prose Works of the Germans. And the first essay in the first volume of this series of the Best Prose Works of the German was Franklin's Way to Wealth. And the first word of the title that was given in the Best Prose Works of the German was moral. So there is clearly another way in which Franklin's text was viewed. Now, another and very popular German version had the title Der arme Jakob, der genug hat, or Jacob, who's had enough, meaning enough of the whining about taxes. You tax yourselves more by your idleness than any government does. This translation, which did not identify the original author, was itself translated a number of times, in the Dutch in particular, and it was even translated once back into English and published in Leipzig as a book for German students of English. There's only one copy of that known, and if you see that too, Elizabeth, buy it. Now, the above represents the majority of the 291 appearances before 1800. They fit in with an increasingly secular world, and they also fit with a greatly heightened interest in economic questions that began around 1750. And of course, a work with the title of The Way to Wealth also increased the likelihood of readers seeing it as a personal economic lesson about how to obtain material security. They likely saw it as a guide, quote, to improving their opportunities for material security, for greater personal independence, and for social respectability. Now, I'm quoting here from David Gerber's Authors of Their Lives, a book about the personal correspondence of British immigrants to North America in the 19th century. And Gerber's list of these three goals that people sought is a good description of what wealth meant in the title, The Way to Wealth. It was not vast riches, it was not becoming like Bill Gates. That's not what The Way to Wealth offered, but advice on how to obtain security, independence, and respectability. In 1796, Parson Weems of George Washington and the Cherry Tree published The Immortal Mentor, or Man's Unerring Guide to a Healthy, Wealthy, and Happy Life. It reprints several texts, including The Way to Wealth. And there is an introduction, unsigned, but clearly by Weems, pointing out that there is scarcely among the evils of life any so generally dreaded as poverty. Then he goes on to describe the felicities of wealth. Wealth always commands respect. Wealth places a man in a state which all must covet, a state of independence. And wealth enables us to enjoy the purest and sublimest pleasures that are to be found on earth, the pleasures of doing good. And if you would enjoy these, listen to the instructions of Dr. Franklin, and let the words of his mouth sink deep into your heart. Despise them not for their simplicity, for simple and unlearned is the multitude to which they are addressed. So Weems is writing of the independence that can come from financial well-being. But the message of The Way to Wealth is not only a promise of that kind of independence, but The Way to Wealth is also advocating independence of thought and action, individualism, if you will. Recall my description of The Way to Wealth, that those awaiting the auction began to buy superfluities, but poor Richard did not follow the crowd. He resolved to wear his old coat a little longer. And the reader is urged to behave likewise. Don't do like most people. Act independently, and you will attain your goals. And some Swedish and Danish editions even separated the final sentences in which those admonitions appeared, thus emphasizing the frugality and independence that are part of that final admonition. When Franklin was identified as the author, as he almost always was after 1800, frequently with biographical introduction, the reader, if male, could think he is being told that he too can rise to great accomplishment and fame, that he can, as some of us were told in our youth, be anything you want to be, Kenny, if you work hard enough at it. Now, some editors and publishers even felt that they had to rein in aspirations by pointing out that Franklin was, after all, a genius. To follow his advice did not mean you would be like Franklin. Here's how the editor of a brief memoir of the life of Dr. Franklin, which has The Way to Wealth in it, put it. But although all of us cannot expect to be Franklin, still we may be equally successful in practicing the virtues as he did. And if not so conspicuous, yet we may be as good and in a degree as serviceable to mankind. Franklin's name and biographical information about him did shape the message, but not for all readers. The AAS copy of the book from which I just quoted was presented to Julia Lawton by her uncle. I don't know who Julia Lawton is, but the uncle may have given it to her because of other texts, not necessarily because of The Way to Wealth, but he may have thought that Julia would profit from it, even though the title gendered it and made it particularly appropriate for boys and men. But we called the earlier title a preliminary address prefixed to the Pennsylvania Almanac. That was gender-free. Then when Ann Fisher placed the text in her popular anthology and added the subtitle on economy and frugality, did she thereby gender toward a female audience? After all, as Poor Richard says, silks and satins, scarlets and velvets put out the kitchen fire. Now men, some of us anyway, are susceptible to finery too. But there's a manuscript at Yale whose text is largely Letters on the Improvement of the Mind, addressed to a young lady by Hester Chapone. And it has inserted in letter 7, which is entitled On Economy, a transcription of Franklin's text. Franklin did not appear in the published editions of Chapone, but that chapter 7 is in the many editions of Vicissimus Knox's elegant extracts from the most eminent prose writers, under the title of Economy Necessary to the Female Character. So some clearly saw The Way to Wealth as having a message for female readers. Not many pages distant in that anthology of Knox's Franklin's Way to Wealth. And Franklin's text did once appear in a book directed specifically at girls, an 1814 Danish textbook for girls' schools. So readers could take away different messages from Franklin's text. And part of the reason it was so widely published is that it could be shaped so as to be directed to particular audiences, whether female or male, young or old, poor or well-off, a peasant or a city dweller, a servant or a young aspiring businessman. The Way to Wealth had a message for you, and very likely there were appearances targeted at you. A young man might be given a copy of Chesterfield's letters to his son, in an edition with Franklin's Way to Wealth added. The parents of children weren't a special target of publishers. In Britain, the Dartons brought out many printings with illustrations that drew on Hogarth's idle and industrious apprentice. And Samuel Wood and Sons followed suit in this country. And no doubt parents sometimes read the text aloud, so Franklin's words were taken in by both sound and sight. And that was also the case with some school books that had the lines numbered for oral recitation. Some appearances were in forms directed at the well-off. In France, in 1827, the elegant volume Esprit de Franklin, bound and boxed in color, could almost have passed for an expensive prayer book. Especially in the languages with the largest markets, publishers brought out multi-volume editions of Franklin. There were 171 collected editions of printings in formats and prices for different markets, some of course expensive. The poor, however, were the target of the greatest number of printings. Some of the numerous British broadsides must have been posted on the walls of factory buildings and other business establishments. And in Belgium and France, more than in other countries, pamphlet editions were published and sold at huge discount for multiple copies, with the idea that they would be widely distributed. And apparently that was done. George Sand, in her novel Malprat in 1837, writes of a character who hawked from chateau to hut those cheap little editions of La Science du Bon Omnichard and other small tracts of popular patriotism. Periodicals of all kinds, some for elites and others for family reading, contained Way to Wealth, as newspapers did in this country. Between 1815 and 1850, there were 659 appearances that I have found, in contrast to 455 before 1815. Now that's a significantly greater number, 200 more in 35 years than in the preceding 55, suggested the text had taken on even new or additional messages. Parson Weems, in his 1796 edition, which was recently reprinted, combined The Way to Wealth with a translation of Luigi Cornaro's work on a healthy and long life. The message was there broadening out wealth, even from security, independence, and respectability. The Way to Wealth was becoming a guide to having a good life, a happy life. In the Massachusetts Magazine in 1789, a periodical that was edited by Isaiah Thomas, the founder of this institution, there was a prefatory note accompanying The Way to Wealth, and it recommended The Way to Wealth for its real intrinsic merit and a tendency to promote the happiness of mankind. And Isaiah Thomas was not alone in using the word happy or happiness. philosophy will sometimes be added to titles of the text. Note that Isaiah Thomas wrote, "The happiness of mankind." The way to wealth was being seen as a means of promoting more than an individual good. It was seen as furthering a social good. It was viewed as creating a new man, which meant a new society. And I could bring out a lot of quotations to buttress this assertion, but I'll start with just one from a Venice edition of 1797. It has a prefatory statement that speaks of the odious distinction between the powerful and rich nobility and the downtrodden and degraded plebeians, extinguishing all love of country, with way to wealth serving as the antidote. Those pamphlets earlier mentioned that were offered at huge discounts for multiple copies were being distributed for a social purpose, to create a strong society by improving individuals, by making of the peasants upstanding individuals. Four appearances in particular symbolize that the way to wealth was seen as a tool for forming societies based on a strong populace. One was a Greek pamphlet published in Paris in 1823. And there are two in Portuguese, one brought out in Paris in 1828 and one in London in 1832. And a Spanish edition printed in Paris in 1825. Each of those nations was in turmoil at this time. And behind all must have been individuals and exiles who sought political and social change in their native countries. To them, the way to wealth was about creating a new man and new societies. It conveyed the idea that the old ways could be changed and that individuals should be able to pursue happiness. So, I think I've demonstrated that it was widely known, widely disseminated, and it seems safe to say that Franklin's preface to his last almanac helped to create the modern world. Thank you.